So Julia Garner, pictured here, is going to be playing the Silver Surfer in the upcoming Fantastic Four film for the MCU. So if you don't know who the Silver Surfer is, he's a Marvel character typically associated with the Fantastic Four. In his kind of background in the comics, and if you notice I said he, and I'll get to that, his background is that he is basically the herald of Galactus. And Galactus is like this giant planet-eating alien monster god creature thing. And basically, Galactus was going to destroy the Silver Surfer's planet, but the Silver Surfer basically made a deal to be like his herald. So he basically goes to the planets that Galactus is about to destroy and basically like say, like, you know, be his herald, so to speak. I'm not sure why Galactus needs a herald. I feel like if you don't want, maybe he just thinks he's so powerful, he doesn't think they could fight back. So he's like, let him know, whatever. But anyway, so that's what the Silver Surfer is. And he's usually associated with the Fantastic Four. The character was portrayed on the big screen in the sequel to the 2004-5 Fantastic Four, and Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer, which I saw in theaters. I remember as a kid, I went in the summer with a friend of mine, and I remember that the film. This is back when there was like actual film stock, but there was an issue with a bug was on the projector, so like they had to stop the movie for like 30 minutes. And when you're like 10 years old, that's like the longest time ever you're like watching a movie. But anyway, I remember not loving it, and I don't think it was very well received. But by default, people consider it the best Fantastic Four movie because it's just the least meh. So you know, take that for what you will. So we have Julia Garner here, and she's now been cast to play the character in the MCU. Garner has had like a really interesting track record in terms of the roles that she's done and the performances that she's turned in. So probably most notably, she was a main character on the Netflix show Ozark, which I only watched like the first episode or so of, but I thought it was phenomenal, and she was phenomenal, and I love her in everything I see Garner in. She was also in two of my favorite films that didn't really get a lot of attention. She was in The Assistant, which was kind of exploration of like a Harvey Weinstein-esque kind of office environment. And then she was in a recent film, The Royal Hotel, which I thought was also great. But neither films did very well financially, and it wasn't like they were super, super well-beloved critically either. And her star has been rising, right? So IndieWire notes that she was gonna play Madonna in an upcoming biopic, but I guess that project has kind of fell through. Maybe it's not dead. Maybe it's a kind of in development hell, but that was something that was kind of on the table for some time. And that would actually be a pretty good casting choice. I just don't know if that's kind of the kind of role, but at least just in terms of visually, like, I think she kind of fits that look. So this would be a gender-bending role, kind of, right? So typically, I know sometimes in franchises in the modern era, studios will kind of, will cynically gender bend or race bend a character, which I have no problem with, and I actually think could be really exciting. But my issue with it sometimes is that it kind of feels like the studios are kind of just throwing female actresses and actors of color kind of just like the scraps, as opposed to creating new and interesting characters for those communities. So that's my issue with it, but I know a lot of people have issues just because they're like sexist and racist and what have you. Sorry if that's how you feel, but that's my kind of read on a lot of it, right? This is technically not that, so she's technically playing Shalla-Bal, which is like a female version of the character. So in the comics, she is a lover of, like, I think the wife, or like the girlfriend's the wrong word, but you know what I mean, like the lover of Norrin Rad, who is like the primary Silver Surfer, and she's also the empress of like their planet, right? So technically they're not gender bending this character. This is technically a character that already exists in the comics. Nevertheless, I'm sure I haven't seen a lot about it, maybe because like people don't care as much about the Silver Surfer the way they do about like other primary like Marvel or DC or any franchise characters, but nevertheless, I'm sure that people complained about it when this news broke. But this casting decision, I think, is interesting because it speaks to Marvel's casting strategies, right? So it kind of started when the MCU started, like if you know anything about the origins of the MCU, you know, it was basically, you know, Marvel in the 90s, this is kind of a tangent, but Marvel in the 90s basically was in very dire financial straits. So it essentially sold off the film rights to all of its popular characters to the highest bidder. So that's why you have like Sony got Spider-Man, Universal got like the Hulk, Fox got X-Men and Fantastic Four and all that stuff, right? And in the mid-2000s, Marvel decided, like, why don't we make a cinematic universe of the characters that we still have the film rights to? And that's how the MCU started. But there wasn't a lot of high hopes for it, so that's why you have, like, Jon Favreau, who at that point was just, like, a comedy director, directing Iron Man. And Robert Downey Jr., who at that point had been, like, a washed-up actor in this leading role, right? So the MCU kind of starts, in terms of its casting strategies, with, you know, not the A-list stars. But they then become the A-list stars. And eventually, as the MCU grows, they start attracting bigger names and bigger stars to, even if they're just supporting roles, right? But because of the issues that the MCU has had over the past, like, maybe 5 or 6 years since Endgame and, like, during the pandemic and all of this, and, like, the oversaturation and just people kind of souring on the MCU and, like, that kind of house style, they're kind of having to rein it back in. So you're kind of seeing a return to, like, they got to go with smaller but no less talented actors, right? And IndieWire notes that Garner here is just the latest in a line of actors, quote, plucked from the indie world, end quote, to join the MCU, right? And for the longest time with actors and also directors was the big one. I remember people talking about a lot. This idea that, you know, originally it was like you were leveling up your career. If you had like a really, really strong indie film, you could then get plucked in, like, oh, you're going to direct Ant-Man or whatever movie it might be, right? But then it kind of seemed like to be a curse. And a lot of the MCU actors have talked about, like, yeah, I made like a shit ton of money, but I kind of not regret being in the MCU, but I had to say no to a lot of really interesting projects because I had this like 6-movie deal where it was like, I need to make sure I'm available to go do this movie, right? So there was this idea of kind of plucking these promising actors and directors and then putting them into like the MCU corporate machine, and it, you know, not always working out for the best. So hopefully it works out here, but I think the MCU is kind of, and Marvel and Kevin Feige and Disney need to kind of humbled themselves and be like, okay, we gotta really just focus on quality here, and we can't just keep throwing money like $20 million at for people's salaries, these huge stars, right? And one last kind of thing about this, that some speculate that this casting choice reveals that this Fantastic Four film is in a different continuity than the rest of the MCU. So why would that be? So IGN notes that this version of the character, at least because the character has been in the comics, but the idea of her being the Silver Surfer originates from Earth X, which was like a, I think, comic miniseries for Marvel that took place in an alternate reality, right? This isn't conclusive, and the articles were worded in such a way where I can't tell if she is playing Shalla-Bal or Shalla-Bal as the Silver Surfer, right? But theoretically, if that's true, a lot of people have been saying that this movie, this Fantastic Four film should kind of do that. It should be like in a separate continuity. So it's just not burdened by, you know, any of the continuity in the MCU that it would then need to, you know, as kind of a prequel, because it's going to take place in the 60s, right? So people are saying, like, okay, well, if Galactus is the primary antagonist, which seems almost certain now that you're looping in Silver Surfer characters, people are like, okay, you have this giant planet-eating monster. You would think that this event from the 60s, people would be talking about it still in the modern era of the MCU, right? So there's a lot of speculation, and this kind of adds fuel to that fire, that the Fantastic Four movie is just going to be like in a separate kind of continuity, so it doesn't have to worry about things like that. I think that's a pretty smart move, just almost as like a soft reset, but you could still, obviously, because multiverse is like a big part of the MCU's current creative strategy, like, you know, you could always loop them in, right? They could always both dimension hop and time travel or whatever, but you could make it work. But I think that would be a really good idea for them to, to kind of make it feel a little bit more distinct. And then because of that, you could, you know, the filmmakers can really lean into the talents of the different actors to make it feel more stylistically unique, so it doesn't fit into that just generic MCU mold. Because I think the Disney is taking the wrong lessons, and they think like, oh, the issue is we're just releasing too many of these. That's part of that, but a big issue is also just the quality. Like, if you release 10 amazing films in a year, I'm not going to completely like, oh, it's oversaturation. No, they're all great. It's oversaturation when it's all just mediocre and generic, or at best okay. I don't want 10 of those, right? So I think if this can kind of be in a separate continuity, it can really lean into the talents of the filmmakers and the cast, now including Julia Garner, to like really make something that feels like an actual person made it. It's not just part of like a corporate machine.